Hello there, welcome back to the channel, to Nerd.World history and a continuation in the ongoing saga of the prehistoric Britons before the Romans. Note that before the Romans, not after or during. I tend to end this around 43 AD, so I do leave out a few details. But if you've been liking this video or any others in the series, please like, share, subscribe, comment down below, because I really want this channel, my goal at the moment is to hit 1,000 subs on this channel by the end of the year, which sounds like it'd be easy, but really not. But, you know, if you're not subscribed, please consider doing so. Also note that this video is also being brought to you from one of my sponsors, which would be Nerd.World. Everyone else. I have several other channels which are listed in the description below, as well as my actual sponsor, The Beard Struggle, but we'll talk about them more later. This episode specifically is going to be on a Celtic tribe called the Cornovii. And for those of you who are going to get confused later in the video, because fun fact about the Cornovii tribe, there isn't just one of them. There is two, definitely. Three, maybe, just in Britain. And that's a weird one in and of itself. And I think I actually picked up on a mistake I've made in one of my previous episodes. Slap me silly. And that is down with the Dumnoni tribe. There is, I think I referred to them as the Cornwalli, and it was the Cornovii. And they have lent their name to the territory in Britain known as Cornwall. And that was a bit of a boo-boo by me. I'm not entirely sure why I made that little cock-up, but I did. I think I just mispronounced it. But there you go. Also interesting about the Cornovii with the Dumnoni is they're not actually referenced by any of the Roman authors during the invasion of 43 AD. The actual, as far as my research can go on this, is they were probably a sept, which means a sort of tributary tribe of the Dumnoni. And they weren't, the Romans tended to be very, very broad in their classifications of people. They weren't, I mean they would, I'm not going to say they wouldn't ever do this, but they tended to be very, almost racial blanket, the Britons. And when they were working with or fighting against a specific tribe, they didn't always worry too much about the internal politics or local regional politics that was happening there. If you're fighting the Dumnoni, you weren't so worried about whether some of the Dumnoni actually were from another smaller tribe with a slightly different possible racial or ethnic ancestral identity. It's all very complicated because there are different waves of Celtic invaders, and there are different waves of integrations, and different areas of Britain adapt faster than others, shall we say. And there's definitely a relocation of peoples here and there, and it's all messy, very messy, and I've tried to clear it up as I've been going with this series, noting people moving from one area to another, but weirdly, with the Cornovii, that doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't seem to be. The Cornovii tribe that lived in Cornwall were not the same people, or related to in any way, as far as I can tell, other than obviously both being human. Culturally, specifically, the tribe that was also in the Midlands, and the tribe that was also in what is now Scotland. So it's all kinda messy. This episode specifically is going to focus on the Cornovii of the Midlands, and I will do another separate episode on the Cornovii of Scotland as I move further north, which should be fairly soon, because I've kind of done a splattering of tribes. I've focused on the bigger ones first, and then I circled around the Cadavaloni, and now we're moving away from them and further north. There's only one major Welsh tribe left to cover, and obviously there's many other aspects of Celtic culture, such as their weaponry, their housing, how they traded, their road networks, the druids, their religion, all of it. It all needs sort of bringing into context and focus, because it is very complicated and kind of mysterious, and a lot of it unfortunately ends up being guesswork and inferred, and it probably would be, and it's ritual. I hate that. Anyway, with that said, we're going to talk about the Cornovii tribe of the Western Midlands of the British Isles. So with that out of the way, that lengthy 5-minute long intro, let's get started. Now, as I said, there probably, or I say probably, wasn't a connection between this tribe and the Cornovii who lived in what is now Cornwall. Interesting fact that I can find, and again, I've mentioned this before, I'm not a linguist, but I always try to research the names, the linguistic origin of the tribe, where its name comes from, because it helps me put them into context of where the tribe may be from, who, incidentally, they may be Brythonic in origin. The name is generally believed to mean horn, or of the horn, basically people that lived on a peninsula, the horn of a country. Now this is fine and well and good for Cornwall, and it's also fine for the Cornovii or Cornovii, who they are later known during the Pictish time period. I'll just mention it before someone else says it. They also lived on a point, but these guys are landlocked. The only water they saw came from the sky or was in the lakes and rivers. They didn't have an ocean next to their territory. Now, so to me, just my opinion, it doesn't seem like that's probably the real reason they're called what they are, unless they originally lived somewhere else and were displaced. If there was a tenuous connection, and this is not based on anything I've researched or anyone else has wrote down, so it's an if there was a connection between the Cornovii of the West Midlands and the Cornovii of Cornwall, then perhaps during one of the later displacements of peoples across Britannia, the Cornovii left Cornwall because the Dobuni or the Dumnoni or someone else forced them to, and they fled north away from new invaders. It's possible, but I have nothing to base that on other than the name. Now, there are several things that are of note about the tribe in and of itself. There is a scarcity of a great deal of pottery, coinage, or other such things from their territory. It's believed, because of, again, rich agricultural soil, they were probably big on farming. And there are also a lot of salt mines in that area of Britain, and they were being mined in the Iron Age. The Romans didn't bring this idea of mining to Britain. And one of their biggest exports will have been salt and agriculture to bring back in. It's also noted that they have some of the largest concentrations of hill forts, which I've mentioned in other videos of other tribes, such as I can't say their name, having a large concentration as well. And you can't help but notice that the thing they have in common is who they border, and that will be the Cornovii, quite a warlike tribe who they bordered to their south. Also to their west were the Ordoviciis, a tribe that is now in Wales, who also could be quite fierce because they were closely linked with the Silures tribe. They were also bordered by the Dobuni, who were subjugated by the Cornovii. So basically they were almost surrounded by potential enemies. But again, hill fort can be misleading. Just because it was called a hill fort doesn't mean it was a fortress. It was a defensible enclosure, perhaps, but not always. Now, I said that these people were probably big on farming. Now, a lot of hill forts were not for military purposes. They were grandiose, they were spectacle. And some of them were little more than animal enclosures. Now, that was more generally a Bronze Age thing than an Iron Age thing, but there was a continuity of it. Now, that's not to say that many of them didn't have a secondary military function. And some of them certainly were what you would have considered the closest thing to be a fortification. They didn't really have a big civilian populace. They had big stores of stuff inside them, and they had obvious battlements built onto the ramparts. Also, the ramparts that you see, those bumps, aren't just displaced earth. It's not like they just dug a pit and that was it. There is strategic structural reinforcement in that ground. In other words, they added stone, even wood, to give it structural strength. They also tended to cover the outer skin of the hill fort with things like lime and chalk, which gave it a white coloration, so they didn't look today like they did then. There are numerous other features and changes to them. Some of them had actual built roads going up to them. They had small fortlets, for lack of a better term, like little guard posts built around them. There were quite often stakes embedded in the ground in the sort of the trenches, for lack of a better term, that would stop anyone besieging up. So it was like an area denial idea rather than necessarily a heavily fortified bunker. There were on occasion, and I'm stressing the on occasion, stone walling on the top of them, and more commonly there was timber. Timber was perfectly good for the kind of enemies the Celts were fighting. Not necessarily against the Romans, but it still certainly slowed them down. So, bear all that about what we know about hill forts, and that is covering it in very brief here. I'll probably do a more dedicated video on hill forts. I'd like to actually go out and do one on location at some point, which is why I've kind of held off doing it. So I'll probably do one at a later date. But that's the hill fort in brief. Now, as I said, the Cornovii had a lot of these things, but bear in mind that they might not have all been for military purposes. You'd have to take it on a case-by-case basis. It's entirely plausible that the ones perhaps near the borderlands were more fortified, but the ones in the inner bits were more like stately gardens of some wealthy chieftain. Speaking of chieftains, there is one we know about. And God, Celtic names. Viroko, I think. God, they're hard to pronounce. I've put it on the screen. And he actually resisted the Romans. The Cornovii fought against the Romans. They allied with the Gadolini and they fought against them and they resisted. Unfortunately, Viroko was killed later during the invasion at the Battle of Wrekin Hill Fort, or rather the storming of Wrekin Hill Fort, where the Romans took the fort, which was a hill fort, certainly, which was probably a bit more defensible, and him and his remaining armies and followers were wiped out by the Romans during that engagement. And that would later go on to be the sort of local capital of the Cornovii area under the Romans, the so-called sort of the civitas of their territory. And it would actually take his name. It's sort of like it would be known as Virokonen, or basically Viroko's town. It would also be Romanized into Viroconium, and then later Cornovium, basically the town of Viroko of the Cornovii. And Jesus, those words. I'm not good at pronunciations. I love history, but my God, I'm bad at it. I'm bad at the pronunciations. But I try. And that is basically the Cornovii tribe. They would engage and fight against the Romans, as I said, but were unfortunately unsuccessful in their attempted resistance to the Romans. Under the Roman governor Aulus Plautius in 47 AD, the tribe was officially annexed into the Roman Empire, basically not long after the Gadolini main territory fell, which was a pretty sweeping victory by the Romans, all things considered. They'd gone from 43 AD to 47 AD, and were already reaching the West Midlands. Now, as I've stressed in previous videos, they'd have a tougher time once they hit the Ordovices and particularly the Silures. They would also, if the Brigantes had actually fought, they might have had a bit more difficulty there, because the Brigantes would have been supplied by several major tribes from the north, not to mention they would have had the Pennine Mountains and general terrain to their advantage, much like the Silures and the Ordovices did. The nice open flat lands of the central and west Midlands and east Midlands of Britain is kind of ideal Roman fighting territory. I should also note the Romans did have a bit more of a bloody nose in some of their southern battles towards the west, but generally speaking, they drew a line in the sand around here for a few years and then began to push north again. Took about 40 odd years roughly for the Roman annexation of what is now England and Wales to fully take place. And there are some that would argue that it never fully Romanized Britain. We've always been a defiant people. And the Romans did tend to embrace local cultures, so whichever local tribe did as they were told and got along with them, usually you were kind of left to your own devices. And things like roundhouses and other such basic settlements of Britannia were still in occupation well into the 5th and 6th centuries. So the Romans never completely stamped out the culture. It actually took the coming of the later instabilities, shall we say, of the early medieval, or what is now more widely known as the Dark Age period, which is a complicated mess of things. But before we get on to the last part of this video, let me tell you about my sponsor, and that will be the beard struggle, because you may have noticed I have a beard, and it is not just something I wake up with and it is this nice and straight as it is right now, although it is needing to thicken up a little bit. I got it trimmed a while back and I think he went a little bit clipper crazy on the sides. But the beard struggle provide all kinds of products that will help you grow it back, like mine, or grow it out as I'm trying to do, or if you basically are intending on growing a beard, or if you are in general already have one and are looking for some new products, check them out. There is a link in the description below which will take you to the website and get you a 15% discount on your first purchase. Now, I'm not going to really tell you to use this brand because I don't feel that you should just listen to my opinion on it. I was first drawn to them because a lot of their advertising and their theme of their company is all Viking based, which is history based, which is something I love, and I find their videos and their promos for their site very amusing, and it actually enticed me into trying the products, and I was pleasantly surprised to discover that they were very nice. But that's a subjective opinion, obviously, so make your own up. Visit the site, decide whether it's something you're interested in buying, maybe buy it, and if you do decide to buy it, you'll get a 15% discount if you use the link in the description below. So, there's that. And with that said, back to the Cornovii tribe. And I wanted to elaborate on something else in a little detail. Now, there aren't many major tribes to cover in Britain before I need to move out. And I've asked in previous videos, do people want me to look at the continental tribes? So I'm going to, but I am going to move over to what is known as Hibernia, Ireland, and God help me though, those are complicated tribes. Such a overlapping cross-pollination history there. But I mentioned that there are waves of Celtic invaders, and invaders is the wrong term. Earlier Bronze Age invasions by such as the Beaker peoples were probably a bit more violent, because the Beaker people, we think of them as being nice and friendly because, they're the Beaker people. It's a funny, stupid name. They're only given that name because virtually all of their burials have these little beakers with them, and that's how they earned the name. But the actual culture was quite a violent one, and almost Hunnic in nature, cavalry-based, quite warlike, very violent. Their invasions were probably a bit more invasion-y. For example, there's genetic evidence that the same people that necessarily built Stonehenge weren't the same people the Romans met. That's how much of a change they made to the gene pool in Britain. That's a depressing thought. And it's not that simple, of course. It's not, because history never is, but in a nutshell. Now, going into the European Celtic tribes and the migrations of peoples and the sheer amount of cross-pollination of cultures there is very different to in Britain, because in Britain, as much as people keep telling me, the Britons weren't Celts, it's like it's not a racial culture. There is no racial Celt. So it doesn't matter. Really doesn't. It's just semantics. What you do or don't call a people from a specific area. You've got Brythonic, you've got Germanic, you've got Gaulish, you've got Belgic, you've got Briton, and you've got Iberian. And I'm actually preparing a video for one of my sister channels soon on a particular period of history, including about Carthage and Rome and stuff. And it has a lot of overlap with Celtic culture, I've noticed, and it's stuff I'm learning myself for the first time, for the most part, and I'm aware that there were Celts in Spain. This is how, when we say the Silures tribe had connections to the Iberian Peninsula, the Iberian peoples, it's not inaccurate. There was movements of peoples between the areas. It's probably wrong to say the Silures as a culture started in Spain. That's probably not accurate, but there was a cross-pollination of cultures between the two, absolutely. I also could be completely wrong, because history, especially with cultures that didn't write very much of anything down, makes it very difficult. One thing that's interesting about the Iberian Celts, and that's a weird term, I know, and I know people are probably going to correct me in the comments below about Iberian Celts. it's Celto-Iberian, the Celtiberians, right, things like that. It's such a complicated mess in Spain. Basically, Spain had influences from multiple major powers: Carthaginian, which are basically Phoenicians, and Iberians and Celts, who are all there. Now, the Iberians are probably the most native, but the Celts arrived first, and they cross-pollinated and blended with their culture. They adopted the Phoenician alphabet and actually wrote some stuff down. And they used their words, but used their alphabet, a bit like how English, French, German all basically use the same alphabet, but you can clearly see they're different languages when it's wrote down. Mess. I'm getting a little off topic, but my point was, there is a little bit of this cross-pollination in Britain, but in Europe, there's a lot of it. A hell of a lot of it. And I'm not really going to cover the post-Roman period or the Romano periods in Europe. I'm going to stick to the same principle that I'm sticking to here, and it's the pre-Roman and basically before the Roman invasions of their particular territories that I'm going to be interested in, and I'll be focusing on. It'll actually push the timeline a little further back, as Gaul, and for that matter Germania and other such areas, they had encounters with major continental powers that had the ability to write stuff down long before we did, or at least long before anything was majorly being written down about us. So it'll be interesting, but it will be time consuming. So those videos are going to be a lot slower on the upload, a hell of a lot, because they're going to be more complicated to make. I mean, I'm already condensing information about British tribes. I could go on for literal hours about individual settlements, burials, some individual named people. It would just go on and on and on. I'm trying to condense it down to basically share my love of history and get people interested in it in a similar way to me and make you explore it. I'm not a historian. I do make mistakes. I try to not make them. I try to limit as many as I can, but every now and again, even my information is a little inaccurate, and I've been researching this for years, but it's a passion of mine. But continental history is more like adjacent in stuff I like, so I'm not as knowledgeable there, and it's going to take me a little longer. But the point was, the cross-pollination of cultures there is extensive, and I will be exploring one aspect of it which does interest me personally, which mentioning Vikings and the beard struggle before kind of reminded me of it. Now, there's a lot of similarities between Viking culture and Celtic culture. They're superficial, but you notice them. It's little things. For example, their dress sense, the way they dressed, the kind of boats they built, the neck torque, common in both Viking and Celtic culture. Now, the Vikings, or the Nordic cultures, because Viking is not, well, that's not what they call themselves. Viking is actually a word we gave them, I think, or at least what we came to know them as, basically a pirate. It didn't refer to everyone from there. The Nordic culture is a different blueprint of culture altogether, but clearly there was enough cross-pollination, particularly when you get to areas like Denmark, where there was both Celtic and Nordic culture right there hitting each other. They become almost indistinguishable, and I know it's not that simple, I know, and that's not what this video is about, but it is something I would like to explore in those videos about the various different cross-pollinations. As a Romanian friend of mine who I used to work with until recently, actually we and him used to have fantastic conversations about the Thracian peoples and the Celtic peoples and their connections and overlaps, because obviously Thracia was what is now Romania, and they weren't Celt, but there was definitely connections, and from there you easily can see the baby steps where you start to get into where the Huns were coming from, and into the steppes of Mongolia, and you see this blending of culture slowly. Now, the further away you get, of course, they're not the same peoples by no means, but you start to see the early stirrings of what would be Russia and places like that, the ancient Rus cultures and things like that. So there's a lot to explore, and it'll be a lot of fun, but it's going to be time consuming, and as much as I'll try and condense it, it'll end up long. I mean, this has already ended up a lot longer video than I expected. But that's a sort of taste of what's going to be coming in those videos, as we are nearing the end of the major tribes of Britannia. There's literally, I think, 6 tribes left to do, maybe. And I'm not including septs in that, the smaller tribes, and other such things. They're covered as I cover them in the videos. But with all that said, as I've rambled on for way too long, we're at the end of the video. If you've made it through all of my rambling and all the way to the end of this video, I thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment down below. Check out all my other channels that are linked in the description below. Maybe there's something on there that you'll like as well. And also, if you are considering growing a beard, or if you've already got one, at least check out the beard struggle. Doesn't hurt to click on the link. Not going to tell you to buy stuff. It's entirely your taste. And if you already have a brand you like, because I'm not going to lie, they're not the cheapest. So, your call. But they're linked in the description below and you will get that 50% discount. And with that said, thank you for watching and bye bye.